Okay, today in this video we're going to be talking about things that you never want to do when you're reshafting a golf club. Let's go! Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Hope you're having a wonderful day. I am here in the build shop and we are going to be talking in this video about some things that you just want to avoid when you're putting together, when you're reshafting a golf club. A lot of this stuff is going to sort of fall into that category of, newer club builders who maybe have been doing some research and have just enough information to be dangerous with. And so a lot of this kind of stems from that knowledge, that information that's floating around out there. All right, the first thing we're going to be talking about are shafting beads. Come in a little jar, something that looks like this, full of these little glass beads. I like to think of them like ball bearings, basically, that help the shaft kind of go into the hosel correctly and be nice and even all the way around. It's great, it sounds good, but very often people sort of take them to the extreme and don't use them the way that they're meant to be used. So I use them, again, I've shown how to use them in different videos, but just again, to cover what you're not supposed to do with these shafting beads. Shafting beads are only meant to just sort of even out an already good, snug fit between a shaft and a hosel. If you have a big gap between the shaft and the hosel and the shaft is just wobbling around like crazy, shafting beads are not going to help you. And what you don't want to ever do is just start dumping these shafting beads into your epoxy mix. Again, what I always say is 5% shafting beads for the volume of epoxy that you're using. You will get into trouble real quick if you start adding half epoxy, half shafting beads or something like that, trying to really thicken it up. That is not what they're made for. That's not what they're supposed to be doing. And you're only weakening the epoxy bond when you add that much bead to it. So again, 5%, all you need. That's what you want if you've got a good snug fit. And if you don't have a good snug fit, well, shafting beads are not the way to fix that. All right, second thing you don't want to do when you're building or reshafting golf clubs, that is worried about getting a stepped ferrule, a collared ferrule, or any sort of adapter style ferrule really, that has the ferrule up here at the top, but then has some little extended piece of plastic on the end. Now, excuse my ring light reflection, but most hosels, or a lot of hosels, are gonna look like this, right? It's just a standard, even on both sides, and the shaft just goes down inside there, nice and even on both sides, no problem. However, some hosels are gonna look like this, again, where you have this little step right here and right here, and it's a little wider at the very top. And a lot of people see that and they think, oh, I need to have a ferrule. This is a really horrible looking ferrule. This is a standard ferrule, let's say, but I need to have a ferrule that has an extra bit of material down here to fill in this space here. And I'll just tell you, the fact is, you don't. There is no need to ever use a collared ferrule. You just don't need it. And in fact, there are some golf clubs that not only have a little step like this, but they may have a rather significant step, maybe looks something like that goes much further down. And they may have certain special adapter ferrules that are, again, even longer than this, that are meant to fit down inside that. And once again, the thing is, you don't need either of them in order to get a good solid fit. Now there's gonna be people who tell you that you need a collared ferrule because if you don't, the shaft is gonna go into the head and you're gonna get all sorts of wobbling, you're gonna get shaft lean because it's able to move around too much and you don't have that collared ferrule in there to lock it down. But the fact is, that little space up there where you have that little step, either for what's designed for a collared ferrule or a bigger adapter ferrule, that is never what's actually causing that shaft to wobble around. What causes the shaft to wobble around is there being a gap at the bottom at the base of the hosel. And that's where you need to fix that space. Think of it like tree roots, right? You need good roots to get that shaft perfectly set in this head. So having an adapter, having a collared ferrule up here at the top still allows the shaft to wobble around all over the place, up, down, left, right. Doesn't make any difference because the bottom still has a loose fit. And if you don't have the bottom of the shaft snug against the hosel, you can very easily end up with shaft lean and you're going to have problems. So what you need is not a collared ferrule. It's not an adapter ferrule. What you need is just a simple brass shim that fits over the end and then gives you that nice snug fit down at the base. And now this shaft isn't wobbling around. It's not going to move. It's set right where it needs to be set so that the epoxy can cure and the shaft will be nice and straight and in line with the hosel. And last thing about these stepped style hosels. I've had people ask me, well, if you don't use a collared ferrule or an adapter style ferrule, don't you end up with a big gap up here that is just going to, be nothing but air in there? And well, quite easily, the answer is no, that's not how it works, because what ends up happening is if you have a shaft that's going down in here and it's covered in epoxy, what ends up happening is when the shaft goes down into the bottom of the hosel, the excess epoxy comes up and it fills in all this space here. So guess what? The epoxy essentially acts just like the collar or the adapter ferrule because it fills in all that space, hardens, and you get the same end result. So don't worry that you're going to have just open air kind of with the shaft floating around in it. The epoxy, the excess epoxy, is going to fill that space and no problem. All right, next thing you never want to do when you're building or reshafting golf clubs, and this has to do with when it comes time to epoxy. Now remember, before you start mixing up the epoxy, you've got all the time you need, right? If you need to measure something more than once, if you need to sand something a little bit more, if you need to re-weight something, whatever, it doesn't make any difference. But once you mix up that epoxy, you are on the clock, right? At that point, you've got a finite amount of time before that epoxy is going to get too firm to work with. And I've seen it happen numerous times where someone will mix up the epoxy, they'll start going through building the clubs, and all of a sudden they'll run into a club that maybe they didn't check beforehand and make sure that the shaft and the head fit together perfectly, or some other little issue comes up. Maybe the ferrule isn't fitting over the shaft right or something. And they'll get sort of flustered, they'll get freaked out, and because they're thinking about, oh no, the epoxy's starting to dry, they'll make a mistake. So in order to avoid all that, just make sure you do all your prep work beforehand. Check everything, make sure everything fits together before you start mixing up epoxy and get into the actual gluing together of the clubs. All right, last thing, and this sort of goes with the last point I was just making, and that is make sure you're choosing an epoxy that is appropriate for the job that you're doing. Specifically, we're talking about how long the cure time is, because you've got essentially 3 different kinds of golf epoxies you can use. One being a very fast sort of 5-minute epoxy, one being sort of a middle ground, say an hour to 2-hour epoxy that sort of starts to harden up in about 30 minutes. And then you've got 24-hour epoxy that gives you a long work time. You've got over an hour to work with those golf clubs, to work with that epoxy before it starts to get hard. Make sure you're choosing the right kind of epoxy for the job you're doing. So if you're doing a full set of irons and you've not really done this before, well, the last thing you want to do is use one of those faster epoxies where you just feel the pressure of, is that epoxy starting to harden while I'm halfway through the set of irons? You want to give yourself plenty of time to work on them, to do them right, and to feel comfortable with what you're doing. So make sure if you're doing a full set of irons and you've never done this before, or you've only done it a couple times, use one of those longer setting epoxies. Now, if you're only doing one club and you want to use the quick 5-minute epoxy or the faster epoxy, that's fine. But just be aware of your own ability, of your own speed, because there's no reason to feel rushed. You can use a 24-hour epoxy. It gives you plenty of work time to do as many clubs as you're going to want to do, and it allows you to really make sure you get everything the way you want it and not have to worry that you're fighting against the clock. So there are a few things you just never want to do when you are building or reshafting golf clubs. And I know there's going to be people out there who say, oh, that's wrong, that's not true, you don't want to do it that way. But look, this is the way I've always done it. This is the way that works. And hopefully you guys have watched me long enough to know that I'm trying to give you guys the best chance of success when you're building and repairing golf clubs. And I think with these tips, you definitely get that. So if you have any questions, go down below, like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell icon so you'll be alerted when I post new videos. Remember to check out my other channel, Elite Fit Golf, where I do golf club reviews and fitting videos. And you can find me on Instagram at Mobile Club Maker. And I'll see you next time. Bye.